I've described how these reflections all in some way come back to the notion that at times are requiring an essential kind of growing up as a species, put in creative systems theory terms, a new cultural maturity. And I propose that something at least similar to cultural maturity will be needed if we are to have a healthy and vital future as a species. In outlining different ways that we can come at making sense of the concept, I've observed that one of the best is to examine some of the new capacities that cultural maturity's cognitive changes make possible. I also observed that effectively addressing any of the most important questions ahead for the species will require these new kinds of skills and capacities. I structured two of my books, Hope in the Future and Cultural Maturity, a guidebook for the future, around these needed new abilities. I touched on a first such new capacity previously, the need to take a newly ultimate kind of responsibility. It deserves a closer look. It follows most immediately from the challenge of getting beyond the mythologizing of culture, making culture our symbolic parent. But full understanding also requires an appreciation of the larger cognitive changes that produce culturally mature understanding. This new, quite ultimate kind of responsibility has multiple layers. The first layer is most obvious, a new, more encompassing responsibility as humans for our actions. We confront it today with the importance of addressing environmental challenges such as climate change and the extinction of species. We also find it in the need more generally to bring foresight to our choices. In times past, we all had classes on the past, on history, but it was rare to find classes that addressed the future, even though the future is the only thing we can affect. As we confront critical challenges, from ever more widely available weapons of mass destruction to the growing risks of global pandemic, in important new sense, we all need to be futurists. The second new kind of responsibility concerns the truths we draw on in making choices. I've described how, as culture gradually loses its parental function, increasingly those truths come to lie in our very mortal hands. We confront a newly double kind of responsibility, not just for choosing correctly, but for determining just what choosing correctly might entail, and this in every part of our lives. This aspect of the needed new responsibility requires more from us than even people who concern themselves with the future tend to recognize. I've emphasized how postmodern anything-goes beliefs in the end leave us wandering aimlessly, devoid of real purpose. The second aspect of the needed new responsibility requires the deeper engagement with our cognitive complexities that come with cultural maturity's cognitive changes. One critical result is that we become responsible for thinking in larger, more complete ways about questions of all sorts. We become responsible for getting beyond a simple answer, ideological beliefs of times past, and bringing more all-the-crayons-in-the-box systemic perspectives to decision-making of all sorts. The third kind of new responsibility gets at the systemic nature of the needed new responsibility in a particularly direct way. In a new sense, all the others ultimately come back to it. We become responsible for engaging ourselves in new, more encompassing, more whole system ways. That all the crayons in the box picture concerns not just how we think about our worlds, but also how we understand ourselves and the nature of identity. We become responsible in all that we do for consciously holding the whole of who we are, all the various aspects of intelligence and all the various parts of our complex natures. Only in holding ourselves in this more whole box of crayons way can we recognize a mature sense of purpose and personal well-being and successfully make the sophistication of choices needed in today's increasingly complex world. A further kind of responsibility is related. We become responsible for engaging relationships of all sorts in more complete ways. Cultural maturity's changes make possible and demand relationships of a new, more whole person, whole system sort. It is a topic that we will come back to in several later episodes. In times past, projection has been central to how human relationships have worked, whether with the chosen people, either other projection that have defined relationships between nations, with the idealized projections of modern age romantic love that made the other person our answer and completion, or with how in times past we have mythologized leaders and given them our authority. In a culturally mature reality, when we project aspects of ourselves, even very positive aspects, relationships ultimately fail. When we effectively hold the whole of ourselves, relationships tend to work, even if we stumble in the execution. Success in relationships of all sorts comes to hinge on the responsibility assumed for owning all the crayons in the box of our internal complexity and connecting to others from this kind of completeness. We reasonably ask how all this new responsibility is something we could tolerate. We come back to the paradox that runs through these short videos. Confronting such ultimate responsibility asks more of us than before it would have been possible to bear. But it is also the case that when we accept this level of responsibility, concerns of all sorts become more straightforward and much more becomes possible. In a particularly defining way, we confront the future's needed new common sense. As always, I encourage your thoughts and questions.